So let me welcome you all here to our first big event of the new year, which is an amazing opportunity to bring actually some of the leaders of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission here to Stanford. We couldn't take you to them, so we brought them here to Stanford to talk about their latest report, the 2025 report to Congress. This is an annual report that they issue, and it's really, I think, one of the best statements of U.S. policy and thinking about China within the government. This is almost an academic quality rigor in the work that they bring. These are like deeply researched reports, extremely well written. In many respects, I think it's really the standard for what our government can produce, and it, I think, is to the credit of the chair and the vice chair for helping pull that together, and the other commissioners and the staff that they have. I want to start by introducing the four panelists today very, very briefly. I could go on at great length about all of their achievements, but I want to get into the meat of the report as quickly as possible. We'll start with the Honorable Randy Shriver, who's chairman of the board of the Institute for the Indo-Pacific Security, but he's also chair of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Commission in 2026. He served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs from 2018 to 2019, and earlier as Deputy Assistant Secretary of East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State. He founded the what was originally the Project 2049 Institute, but is now known as the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security. Mike Kuiken is Distinguished Visiting Fellow here at the Hoover Institution, and he's 2026 Vice Chair of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Commission and a Distinguished Visiting Fellow here. He advises the Special Competitive Studies Project and serves as on Anthropic's National Security and Public Sector Advisory Council. A little bit later in our session, we're going to be joined by Hoover Fellow Aaron Baggett-Carter, who's an Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Southern California and also affiliated with Stanford Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law in the U.S. and UC San Diego's 21st Century China Center. And then finally, Drew Endy, who's a Science Fellow here at the Hoover Institution, where he leads the Biostrategy and Leadership Initiative. He's also a professor of bioengineering here at Stanford University, and his work combines biology, engineering, and public policy to address the challenges of rapidly advancing technology. We're going to dive into the report in just a few minutes, but in order to set that up, I'd like to ask Randy and Mike really to start by giving you all a chance to understand the Commission, the work that it does, the role that the Commission plays in the policy process, and then maybe to walk us through what each of you believe are a few of the key takeaways in the most recent report. So Randy and Mike, over to you.
Great, thank you. I can start. Glenn, thanks for having us and pulling this together. You know, we advise Congress, but Congress listens to y'all more than they listen to us, so it's important that we get out and talk to folks about our findings in the report and our recommendations, so appreciate this opportunity. We're one of the older congressional commissions. We were founded through legislation in 2000,
yep.
and stood up in 2001.
25 years this year, baby.
That's right. We're having all kinds, you probably got the flyers, 25th anniversary. So one of the older commissions, we represent congressional leadership by virtue of our appointments. So we're 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, appointed by leadership in both chambers. So Senator Thune gets 3 appointments, I'm one of them. Schumer gets 3, Mike is one of them, but also Jeffries gets 3, and Johnson gets 3. We serve 2-year terms, and we come together to produce an annual report, which is informed by hearings that we hold and travel. We do travel in the region of the Indo-Pacific, often visit Indo-PACOM for the military and security aspects of that. And everything is sort of geared towards this annual report, which, thank you for the compliments. I think it's a tremendous report, and I can say that and not sound immodest because it's really the staff that puts that together, does all the research and the excellent writing. The commissioners have a role in sort of editing that, but the primary role of the commissioners is then to come up with recommendations based on what the staff has produced and what we've heard through hearings and travel. And then we put that forward to members of Congress, and I always like to say when we release the report, it's not an end point, it's a start point. So we've been busy briefing members of Congress, doing public events, podcasts, and the like. And so we're at that critical stage where we're trying to position ourselves for potential legislation in the coming year. We're really aiming a year out with every report, because the recommendations, if they're going to be most impactful, meaningful, have to end up in legislation, which is the next cycle, and usually the NDAA, since that's about the only thing that passes these days. But Mike, what did I miss, or how can you correct me?
No corrections. The only thing that the really funny story is the origin story. It's right around the time where Congress is debating WTO accession. And if you go back and look at the legislative history, it's amusing because it's basically clear that Congress has decided they don't trust two entities. One, the Chinese government, and two, the executive branch. And so they create this commission basically to keep sort of constantly watchful eye on those two entities. And it's like a classic sort of congressional story. There's probably a negotiation. Somebody was like, I'm sick and tired of this, and we're going to do this commission. So it's sort of a classic congressional outcome. That's the only thing I would pile on.
Say your thing about over the horizon.
Oh, yeah. So one of the long-time serving commissioners was a guy named Mike Wessel. He was on the commission for, almost 25 years. He sort of oriented the commission over the years to think about, don't think about the alligators closest to the boat, look at the horizon and look over the horizon, and let's make sure we're increasing the literacy of members of Congress and the larger sort of national security community in Washington on the issues that are going to be coming up in front of them, not today, but it's sort of in the future. And it's been helpful over the years because when things happen in sort of the U.S.-China dynamic, there's often ideas to fall in on for members of Congress. So like outbound investment was just one of these things where the commission came up with this recommendation when I was still actually in the Schumer operation, and it was finally signed into law this year in the National Defense Authorization Act. And again, it was something the commission came up with years ago, and it's something that sort of went through a deliberative cycle and ended up in legislation. So that over the horizon view, that sort of giving the feedstock to members that they can fall in on I think is a really important role of the commission. The one thing I didn't realize when I joined the commission is, I sort of got ready. I've been like a partisan warrior for Leader Schumer for 7.5 years. And when I got there, I rolled up my sleeves. I was ready to start knocking my elbows around with, Randy. And it was like we were talking about how we're going to find, bipartisan agreement and consensus on things. I was like, wait, what are we doing? And it was actually wonderful to sort of see that we were debating issues in a very serious way, and we weren't finding lowest common denominator outcomes. We were saying how far can we sort of push this idea, but still have consensus. And so I think that atmosphere is super refreshing. And I think your sort of reflection on the report shows that it is working, and it is a secret sauce that we work hard to maintain.
Does that speak well of the commission or ill of your former?
Both. Not ill.
Well, maybe you can run a master class on how to get that done.
Yeah.
Because
I think I'll only teach with Randy.
You all are models for doing it, and the report is really a model piece of scholarship. So let me ask you to each sort of pull on your favorite takeaways from the report, the issues that were most meaningful and important to you, because as you say, you've done a great job of horizon scanning, getting things on the agenda early so that I think the members have a little bit of consciousness and mind share on the topic before things really blow up. And so you've done a good job of educating them and preparing them for what's going to probably end up on their desk in legislation a year, 2, 3 from now. So what are your favorite takeaways, or what do you think is most impactful there?
You'll probably talk about the number one, right?
Sure.
Yeah. So we have a process where we determine a top 10, which is very sort of sophisticated and mature. We just get in our room and we vote and raise hands. And so Mike will talk about the number one recommendation we had this year. I tend to focus a little more on the security issues, the military issues, former Navy intelligence officer, former DOD person twice. And sometimes that's at a general level of how the PLA is doing in modernization. Sometimes it's more specific to particular contingencies. And we had a couple of recommendations related to Taiwan this year, which are, yes, about Taiwan, but really about where the PLA is going and what we think we need to do to keep pace, if not, keep an edge for the purposes of deterrence. One was, we call it the show your homework recommendation. We have a law, the Taiwan Relations Act, that most people, if you know anything about it, you say, well, yeah, we sell arms to Taiwan. which is true. We're obliged by law to provide weapons of a defensive character for sufficient self-defense of Taiwan. But there's another part that says the U.S. must maintain the capacity to resist force if asked to do so by national command authority. So Indo-PACOM having capabilities, having a plan is not a choice. It's not a policy option. It's actually a legal requirement. But to our knowledge, they've never been asked to prove it. Come in a classified setting, unclassified setting, and tell us why you're confident you have the capacity to resist force in a Taiwan contingency. And if you can't, the purpose is not to put anybody unfairly under a spotlight. If you can't, please identify the gaps and let Congress know where to fill in. And that's important. The Indo-PACOM commander has the ability to do an unfunded priority list every year, but it's not necessarily Taiwan specific. We want this to be, given Congress's role in oversight and given the role that they gave themselves in the Taiwan Relations Act, we think that this was an important thing to ask the administration. Number two, one of the major initiatives from Indo-PACOM and the Department of Defense right now, by the way, I say Department of Defense, our authorizer still authorizes it as Department of Defense, so this is not a slight against anybody. Well, maybe a little bit. But we say Department of Defense. The Department of Defense has been pushing posture initiatives in the Indo-Pacific. We play an away game every time. We're a distant power. We have 100,000 forward deployed forces, but they're heavily concentrated in two places, Korea, sort of busy and occupied with the Korean Peninsula, and Japan, and most of that is consolidated in one place, Okinawa. So to fight in what's called an A2AD environment, anti-access area denial environment, ballistic cruise missiles, we need posture diversification and dispersal opportunities. You only do that if you have the agreement of the governments that are the sovereign owners of those pieces of real estate, but you also need facilities. And so Indo-PACOM has been working, well, it's actually a whole of government to develop sites in the Philippines, particularly in northern Luzon and Palawan, the places with proximity to the Taiwan Strait, places like the Japanese Southwest Island chain with proximity to the Strait. But that's been coming online very slowly. And our proposal is that since a lot of this relates to Taiwan, why not have Taiwan pay into a fund that helps boost our posture initiatives? They buy weapons, they buy training, they buy all kinds of things. How about them contributing to deterrence by virtue of helping us in these posture initiatives? So those are two that are specifically about Taiwan, but really about the direction of PLA and what we think we need to do to maintain deterrence.
Right, there's a lot of Philippines in this year's report, actually.
There's a whole other plan Philippines, which is, you know, I look forward to getting into that too.
Super. Mike?
The number one commission recommendation this year was economic statecraft recommendation, and actually Randy and I wrote an op-ed that was sort of the feed corn for this idea, which was after 9/11, one of the things that happened, you know, in addition to sort of invading Afghanistan and all of sort of the military elements of that, was we did a huge reform of the intelligence community, and we also did a huge reform of the sanctions community and how it's sort of powered and its sort of operational capability. And I think the conclusion that we came to as a commission was that we're not in sort of a, you know, a 1 year, 2 year economic statecraft sort of conflict. This is going to be an enduring sort of conflict that we have, and we haven't done anything to reorganize the executive branch in a way that allows it to really operationalize things and the tools that it has. We did that with sanctions after 9/11, but the tool that we see talked about all the time these days is export controls. And so I don't know if anyone here has heard about the Bureau of Industry and Security. If you've actually ever gone to visit the undersecretary, it's like the darkest hallway in the Commerce Department. I don't even know if the lights work. The office is a dark, dank room.
It's a very unhappy place these days.
Yeah, so like my point is like, you know, this is apparently the weapon of choice right now for this economic statecraft battle, and yet we're not resourcing it. And not only are we not resourcing it, but we've never made it part of the intelligence community. And if you've worked with the intelligence community over the years, and this is what happened after 9/11 with the sanctions community, is if you're not an entity inside of it that can drive collection requirements, you're basically either tin cupping around, begging for sort of intelligence and begging for your collection requirements to get handled. And so a big part of the recommendation is say, let's take the Bureau of Industry and Security and finally sort of make it an element of the intelligence community. And then the other thing is, if you really look at the broader export control community in the executive branch, it's essentially a bunch of warring feudal states.
Right.
DoD plays a role, State Department plays a role, Treasury plays a role, Commerce plays a role. I'm sure there's other cats and dogs. USTR undoubtedly plays some sort of peripheral role. And so what we've sort of said is we need to think about orienting this into one organization so that there's unity of command. You know, Randy from the military perspective always talks about sort of Indo-PACOM and this idea of unity of command. And so taking that concept, applying it to the economic statecraft community was something that we wanted to be very thoughtful about. And so we sort of took the piece that Randy and I wrote saying, you know, BIS, intelligence community, and said, this isn't big enough. We actually have to be a little bit bigger about this. The recommendation itself has lots of good ideas in it. The hard part is going to be sort of like, how do we get Congress to sort of adopt this idea? Anytime you go into sort of export controls, just like you have the warring feudal states in the executive branch, you have committees in Congress who have very different views about how this should be done, and you also have jurisdictions of these committees that are very sensitive issues in Congress. So we gave them a big idea instead of sort of the traditional Washington think tank industrial complex, like let's just change the dials a little bit and let's see what happens.
Yeah, it's a very intriguing and powerful idea, and I think the moment is ripe for serious consideration of it. You know, it's interesting you mentioned 9/11 because the last time that I can think of a major reorg happening along these lines was the creation of Homeland Security, really, and the consolidation of so many different authorities and agencies that had been previously dispersed into a single home. And perhaps there's a cautionary note in there these days, but you know, it's worth thinking about that. You know, perhaps we want to avoid a truly crisis situation before we kind of get out in front of that. And skate to where the puck is going to be.
I mean, like you can see the success of the sanctions reforms in the response to Ukraine.
Yeah.
Like the sanctions community at Treasury and across the interagency is truly operationalized. They were able to do an amazing job very quickly. The export control community is not resourced to do that, both from a dollars perspective and from just butts and seats perspective.
Right.
And so like we have to think about sort of reinvigorating or just invigorating this community.
So then the question really is, how do you reconstitute workforce? Because in the last year there have been tremendous staff reductions across a lot of those components. And the question really is, I think, let's wave your magic wand and say if you were able to achieve something like this a year, 2, 3 down the road, do we actually have the institutional capacity in place to make it work, or would we have to do a lot of rebuilding as opposed to just rewriting authorities and moving desks around?
Well, I think if we got authority to do it tomorrow, you're going to MacGyver the thing together based on what's already there, for sure, which is what Department of Homeland Security was. And there are cautionary notes, not only in terms of what's happening today, but at that time it was a pretty difficult process. But look, I think you always talk about feudal states across the interagency. There's difficulties intra-department. You know, BIS is the lone entity within Commerce that's not trying to promote sales and promote exports and trying to sell everything to everybody for the purposes of helping the business community. There's very similar phenomena happening within Treasury, within State Department. So. Right. The art of economic statecraft and getting harmonization across all this is, we think, critically important. You would absolutely have to go out and reconstitute a workforce to do this well. It requires a degree of expertise that is being sapped through retirements, through RIFs. And you know, when the federal government started cutting through the DOGE process, they hit an easy button, which was, let's go after the probationary workforce because we actually have the authority to fire them. We won't get challenged legally in the way we might by the unions and others if we go after tenured professionals. Well, what did you do when you did that? You got rid of the young people. You got rid of the people that were on the front end of their careers because those were the people in probationary status, first job, second job, early on in their careers. Right. Whether or not we create this Economic Statecraft Institute, we are going to have to start hiring young, smart, talented people again, no question. And you know, the government has already sort of figured this out, and so what they're doing is they're contracting, they're doing a lot of things to bring talent in, which is probably more costly than having kept the workforce in place to begin with. But they're already figuring out that they've cut really essential people with really unique expertise that we have to recapture.
I want to seize that point because we get a lot of Stanford students here who are incredibly bright and they're considering careers in public service, but they read the newspapers also. And I try to tell them that actually government, will perhaps overcorrect and wake up and realize that it has missions that it needs to fulfill and it doesn't have butts in seats to fulfill them. And so if they play their cards right, there may be a hiring surge. There may be an opportunity for young, hungry, talented people to enter government and build careers the way they did in years past. And there's a tremendous opportunity there. So that might be the silver lining for what we're experiencing right now. So let's turn, you raised the question of Taiwan and international security. How are we doing in the Taiwan Strait with regard to peace and stability? And then let me ask you to pivot for your own reflections on the purges that we've seen in the Central Military Commission in China. Is this a stabilizing influence? Is this something, what do you think is driving it, and what do you think it means for China's ambitions in the region?
So being at a place like Stanford University, I should give a grade, an A through, well, you really don't give C's and D's. And, hey, come on. We know. But I would say it's not an A through F, it's an incomplete. That this administration has picked up on first-term work and excellent work of the Biden administration on helping Taiwan modernize its force in more appropriate ways for the threat. So you probably hear of the so-called asymmetric counter-invasion capabilities. I think that has been successful, but a work in progress, helped by Taiwan spending more on its defense. I already mentioned the posture initiatives. I think those are, the Biden administration added 4 ECTA sites, Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites in the Philippines, and these ones are the ones with proximity to Taiwan, Luzon and Palawan. I think when Admiral Paparo talks about hellscape, it's a nice sort of catchphrase and it creates a certain imagery, but in fact, we're always playing an away game. We will always be outmassed. We have to go in the direction of some blend of unmanned autonomous capabilities to be able to compensate for time and distance and being outmassed. Now, that's all good, but as the humorist Will Rogers said, even if you're on the right track, you can still get run over if you're not going fast enough. And so I think a lot of this is it coming online quickly enough, and are we going to be able to do this at the speed of relevance to maintain deterrence? And I think that's a real question, which relates to your second question. You can get really smart China analysts in a room and people that spend a career as China watchers and qualify as genuine experts who will be on different sides of this. This is a power move. This shows that Xi Jinping is large and in charge, and it doesn't matter, 4-star. It doesn't matter if you're a combat veteran. Doesn't matter if our fathers were friends. I'm still going to fire you for failing to bring modernization efforts to the point where we can operationalize Taiwan quickly enough, that not rooting out corruption in a robust enough way, et cetera, et cetera. And some will say, no, this is a man who's paranoid, that doesn't like the perception that people are developing independent bases of power. If you look at PLA purges, these are the most recent 2, but in fact, 3 defense ministers, many members of the Central Military Commission through time, now into his 3rd term. At the 3- and 4-star level, pretty significant, even at lower levels, very significant purges. So to me, I see a little more of that paranoid side and thinking that the military should not be this sort of independent power base that could either threaten him, and I'm not saying a coup was imminent or that it's really even something that we should spend a lot of time and attention and resources toward, but a military that has an independent view, a military that can push back, a military that can go in and say, boss, we're not ready, or Xi Jinping doesn't want any of that. Right. He wants unquestioned loyalty, and I think the degree to which he's sought loyalty over professionalism, over competence, all of that is a track record to me that suggests somebody is very anxious, if not paranoid, about the PLA.
I was waiting for Randy to do it. He didn't do it. He's got this line where he usually says they've moved from exercise to rehearsal. And just this, you stole from him?
I don't steal it. I quote him.
Borrow. Well, I'll quote him too. And so, I mean, we're really seeing that. And then this past weekend, the Chinese flew a drone in at an incredible altitude that was above Taiwan air defense systems. I mean, that's called operational preparation of the environment in the military sense. And so we are seeing the Chinese constantly move the goalposts on the status quo in Taiwan. And I think in Washington, we see these things almost as like microaggressions. And we think they can be handled in sort of like baby steps and diplomatic channels. But at some point, we do really need to be thoughtful about this as this goalpost continues to move on us. And then the second thing that I would just mention is, when I interviewed with Chuck, he asked me about my Dutch heritage and interrogated me on it and told me I needed to read this book called The Island at the Center of the World, which is about Manhattan and how it was sort of settled by the Dutch. I was thinking about that as I was listening to Randy, because Taiwan is really the island at the center of the world today. And think about a scenario where all of a sudden all the chips that the AI companies are buying and sort of all of the other advanced tech companies are buying are no longer available to us. There is no other place on Earth right now where you can buy a chip for our iPhone. And that is an incredible scenario when you think about it. The Japanese are about to get Rapidus, hopefully up and running. Hopefully the facility in Arizona will be up and running. But it really has become the island at the center of the world. And I sometimes think in Washington, we think about it in the context of a conflict, but we don't sort of unpack it and say, well, wait a second. If you take Taiwan and China, all of the legacy chips on Earth come from there. And look around this room. The lights that are in my eye right now have a legacy chip in it or a foundational chip in it. My iPhone has an advanced chip. All of those are coming basically from two places, and that is China and Taiwan.
Right, stranglehold on the global economy in a sense.
Yep.
Let me invite Drew and Aaron up to the stage, and we'll expand the conversation. And while they get situated, one of the first hearings, if not the first, that you had last year, which is reflected in the report, is...
Glenn, you even have the co-chairs of it.
Yeah, exactly, it was focused on Made in China 2025, who is winning. So that was literally the title of it. Drew appeared talking about biotechnology.
The staff got very mad at us for putting a question mark at the end of it.
So let me ask you, who is winning and why? And where?
I mean, I think the answer, so the reason we asked who is winning is we wanted to sort of take a look at Made in China 2025. It's a 10-year plan. How are the Chinese doing? I think the report card that we put out, which is available on our website, is basically they had some incredibly ambitious goals, and they maybe didn't make all of them, but they did incredibly well. And one of the reasons we had Drew was because an area where they made incredible investments was to do well in pharmaceuticals. And the consequence, or either planned or accidental, is that they built this infrastructure layer in the bioeconomy for their country, and it is now they're sort of racing, potentially racing ahead of us at a very fast speed. And I think in biotech, they're doing very well. I think in quantum, I think we don't know how well they're doing, but the assumption should be that they're hiding their hand and they are aggressively pursuing a crack to public key encryption. I think in aerospace was the other area, and we had a space hearing separate from this, but in the aerospace community, it's an area we don't pay a lot of attention to in Washington, but I think there's a lot of dependencies that remain there. Europe and the US still provide an incredible amount of parts and technology into their aircraft programs. And then where were the other big areas we looked at, Randy?
Well, I think the thing I would add to what Mike is talking about is it also revealed something about a system versus a system.
Right.
I'll take the United States every day of the week, twice on Sunday, and all the warts and all, I'll take it over China. But their system does certain things very well, and they are able at a national level to prioritize. They are able at a national level to resource, and they are able to, at a national level, to take a comprehensive approach to a problem set. So if they're, I don't want to take any of Drew's material, but in biotech, it's not just what they're funding at the research level, it's what they're doing in primary schools. Yeah. It's what they're doing societal to make this field attractive. Do you want to be a pro athlete, a rock star, or do you want to be a biologist? The Chinese system can do very well at that system of prioritization and resourcing. They're not 10 feet tall, but they sure can do that.
Yeah, they're executing across the full stack in a very intentional, thoughtful, and driven way.
I mean, quantum
they're simply trying harder.
Quantum is a perfect example too. Yeah. We have this sort of very diverse academic space in quantum where we're pursuing all of the different pathways to a quantum computer. The Chinese have gone all in on superconducting. And that means that they're sort of allocating all resources opposed to sort of this hodgepodge of programs that we have. Maybe it's better to have our way of doing it. Maybe it's better to have their way of doing it, but it does help you sort of see the differences.
So let's pivot then to biotech and bring Drew into this conversation, because in some ways I think biotech is a microcosm for what you were just describing, and it's incredibly important as a foundational technology. I think, kudos to the Commission for putting it on the radar, because I think biotech has not yet achieved the sort of level of mind share in the ordinary American's brain that other things like semiconductors or quantum or electric vehicles may have. Drew, let's start with why we should care, what the stakes are, and then really what your prescription for American competitiveness could be. Are there things that we can learn from China in humility that we should be adopting? Are there reforms to how we've done business in the past that we should adopt in order to hold on to our edge in a few areas and perhaps recover it in others?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn, and Mike and Randy for your service and work. Biotech, you think of it as a canary in the coal mine or a bellwether. It's both an old technology and an emerging technology, and it's one that invented in the United States 50 years ago here at Stanford with genetic engineering, but still very, very young, right? And so China takes a look at biotech and is going, hey, well, we have a chance here, right? It's not that we have to overcome half a century or a century of legacy. It's like, this is a green field to compete. So when we think about how the US is doing broadly, in terms of holding our edge or winning, if that's how you want to frame it, biotech's a very interesting domain. Now, it plays in a couple different ways. Biology itself operates at the intersection of energy, data, and stuff. Joules, bits, and atoms. Like a photosynthetic organism harvests energy, fixes carbon, and makes things, right? Starting with food, fuel, and medicines, but increasingly anything we can encode in DNA, right? It's a general purpose technology. Beijing operates with the reality strategy. Like, how do we organize the provisioning of joules, bits, and atoms, energy, information, and stuff sufficient for our country, and to the extent we can pull that off, to create leverage elsewhere? They're fairly straightforward about that. And so I look to Beijing on bio, and it maps very nicely to a government that's got a reality strategy. I go to DC, I see politics. Right? Now the commission is incredibly important because it's doing nonpartisan, long-time scale work. And I want to acknowledge, you talked about some of your recommendations. I guess you left for me to celebrate the fact that recommendation number 3 from this year's report is around pharmaceutical supply chain resilience and getting that right. You think rare earths and chips are supply chain problematic, antibiotics, things that protect you from spitting up a tube when you need a tube to keep breathing. Like all these medicines that we take for granted, the majority of them are not coming through supply chains we control. So that was recommendation number 3, I think. Recommendation number 4 was to really get at the foundations of how we compete and win, both on bioscience, biotechnology, and bioeconomy. Everything from how we make measurements and standards for the bioeconomy. Recommendation number 4 is calling for a biometrology lab at NIST, this part of the Department of Commerce, which is an absolute gem, but often ignored. It just, why do we care about biology? We are of biology. Biology is a strategic domain. It's becoming a general purpose technology. These are words that are easy to string together and hard to wrap your mind around. If you come back to Taiwan, here's the fantasy version of a long time scale future. The reason Taiwan's the island in the center of the world with respect to computing is because we've made computers hard to make, right? And we've made computers hard to make because we use top-down patterning, like a kid at the beach making a pattern in the sand with a stick, but now it's machines from the Netherlands, right? And it's still that top-down, high-precision engineering. The Semiconductor Research Corporation has a 20-year roadmap for doing bottom-up self-assembly using biomolecules to template the production of semiconductors. Technically, it's impossible today. It won't solve a supply chain problem within 10 years. But 20 years, it's imaginable you could unlock biology as a general purpose technology and have a complementary path for growing computers, which means you could operate that process not in one spot on Earth, but anywhere you needed to do it, much more resiliently. And it's only through the Commission's work, frankly, where I've had any chance of starting conversations in the current political context of DC that's looking more strategically on longer timescales to how we might think about biology as a strategic domain.
Right. I mean, and so one of the things I'm struck with this administration is how we seem to be breaking with past orthodoxy about how the solutions to our economic competitiveness challenges posed by China lie outside of purely free market-based solutions. There are things like, the trade war, of course, and the serial resort to tariffs, but also in the rare earths and semiconductor space, we're doing things that previously we might not have done because we were too reliant ideologically and I think strategically on market-based solutions. The state's now an active market player in a way it wasn't. So orthodoxy has really been shattered. I mean, Intel's now a state-owned enterprise, for goodness sake, and we're taking a cut off every NVIDIA chip sale to China. And so is there a way where we go forward in the space economy and the bioeconomy in which the state sort of reinvents its traditional role and helps us either as a backstop, as a way of smoothing out the valleys of death, compete with a bit of fire against fire with China?
I mean, Randy, on a different topic, Randy and I were lamenting some of the tools of the Cold War the other day. I mean, the Defense Production Act, people forget, this thing's existed since World War II. Yeah. Every department and agency used to have what they call the DPA officer, a human that was basically like, I have this problem, Mr. Secretary, I need DPA to solve it. The secretary would go talk to the DPA officer. And like, those tools have always existed in our government. We're just seeing them being used again. So I don't want to go after the administration too much on using these tools because these are tools that we've had in the toolbox for good reason for a long time. And so using them is important. People always forget about, and this is one of the other recommendations on Biotech, about the Department of Energy Loan Program Office. Mm-hmm. This office has existed for decades, and it does incredible work to find companies that are in early stage that have incredible technologies and really just need some cash to make sure that they can get a demand signal to private industry to say, or private finance to say, folks, invest in these companies. So one of the recommendations is like we have to think about the Department of Energy Loan Program Office as it comes to its reauthorization this year, and make sure we're drawing the circle around biotech, because they're sort of in a winter, sort of like the AI community was for years, and like there's reasons for that. Theranos was a disaster, and there's some other things that have happened in the community over the years, and then there's still the Solyndra sort of hangover as well. But we do need to sort of surge resources into it, and the administration, Dario Gil and Paul DeBar and those guys are doing good work to sort of think about those tools that we've had in the toolbox for a long time and reinvigorating them.
So Drew, let me ask you to grab your magic wand and ask for the things that you think would really turn the corner on the trajectory we're on in the bioeconomy.
Yeah, I can be specific, but I want to start with two broader recommendations. One is, as a domain of emerging technology, there has never been a domain more overdriven by immediate utility and application than biotech. Biotechnology is a domain of last resort. If you have a horrible disease and you can't cure it by going to the hardware store, you go to the biotechnologist and beg, right? And what that means is for 50 years, the good people working to advance biotechnology have experienced this unbelievable pressure to solve problems right now. And it's why at an appropriations level across the federal government, and a democracy especially, the funding goes to agencies that are curing diseases right now. And our newest federal agency in the biospace, ARPA-H, which is terrific in and of itself, is cure more diseases for more Americans faster. And who would be against that, right? We all want that. But there's never been a domain of emerging technology where we've competed and won by spending money like that. For every other domain of emerging technology, we've taken the limited public money and we've invested it in the engineering foundations that let the science become technologies that the private sector can bring to market. It's how we got strategic computing, it's how we got ARPANET becoming internet. Right? And we're just out of order in terms of our appropriations. And the reason there's a problem is because biology as a general purpose technology has infinite applications. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, that's why there's like huge amounts of requests for budget. So I think we could shockingly like do more with less by reallocating public treasure down the foundations of the science and engineering of biotech. That's thing one. Thing two, in general, there's certain things you have to pull off, and this is building on what Kaiken said, when you try and get to full-scale economic impact or full-scale provisioning to what the Defense Department needs, you have to get capital deployed to get your manufacturing process operating at scale. And one of the things you can think about is, well, let's get Congress to appropriate all of it, right? But it's like, you know, if you think about this for biology and biomanufacturing, that might be $100 billion over 5 years. That's a lot of money. You know, and we want to sustain that every, you know, the next 5 years, the next 5 years. It seems to me like there's other mechanisms that we could use to incentivize and empower the private sector to deploy private capital to pick up on scaled manufacturing. So one idea we floated over last year was what we call bio bonds for the bio belt, tax-free bonds at the state level that let private sector capital allocators pick up on stuff and make go, no-go decisions around how do we get this factory resourced.
Right.
And so I think that's complementary to some of these other loan programs. Now, specifically, number one recommendation, which I was pleased to see, is number 3 in the Commission's report. I mentioned it already, a biometrology lab at NIST. You know what the unit of resistance is for electricity and wires? The ohm, right? What is the unit of measure for DNA being read out in a cell? We don't know yet. And you could not have ChatGPT, you could not have GPS, you could not have anything in electronics without the ohm as a way of coordinating measurement of wires getting wired up, right? So physics got a physical measurement lab at NIST. We get the kilogram, the meter, the second, the ohm, gives us GPS and everything else. Chemistry, the next foundational science, got the material measurement lab at NIST. Biology needs a biomeasurement lab at NIST. It needs to be $500 million a year, $250 million a year. There needs to be hundreds of people working on it. So without a doubt, recommendation number 1, it's high leverage, huge return on public investment. I won't go through the whole list, but I'll just give you another example. We've heard about AI. It's having a moment. AI is landing in biology. You can take DNA sequences and train large language models on them. So instead of ChatGPT in English, you have a tool that you prompt and it emits DNA sequences. The thing about a DNA sequence is it's very hard to speak DNA. You know, like we can speak English or French or Chinese or Spanish, but like very few people can speak in TAA, TA, CGA, CTC, ATD, ATD. You know, it's like and so the only way to make sense of this stuff is to build it and test it. So if we want to have world leadership in AI and bio with large language models and whatnot, we need large language laboratories. Places that do high throughput world leading testing of computer generated designs. And so that was another recommendation that showed up in my testimony a year ago. And I think that's something that fits nicely within Project Genesis and what Dario Gill's hopefully pulling together through DOE and the National Lab System. So
are other people building those things now? Is there a race on to kind of...
Oh, we're losing by a lot. I mean, it's hard to overstate the situation.
Yeah.
You know, we've scratched at it a little bit, but like in my assessment, China has taken an all-of-nation approach. Randy covered it pretty well. You know, it's like the kids are being incentivized to pursue careers in biotechnology, right? They've taken an all-of-nation approach to biotechnology for 25 years, going back to the sequencing of the human genome. They're crushing it. You know, my colleague Chenli Liu, who is in Shenzhen, now operates the Shenzhen Institute of Advanced Technology. It's a national laboratory for synthetic biology. Had lunch with him in Europe recently, and he's got a team of 2,500 staff and 2,500 students and postdocs. He has 5,000 people. I have 5 PhD students at Stanford, right? And the national lab up the road is still doing wonderful work, but it's optimized for the imperium of physics. Nothing against that. And we, you know, like across all the natural sciences, China has building national laboratories without the legacy portfolio going back to Oppenheimer, which is what we're carrying here. The other thing I'll say just in passing, you cannot understate the motivation for S&T leadership that is apparent in Beijing. You know, in one, this is a little bit simplistic, but at least I'll just get out in case we want to unpack it. You know, think about what the United States did in response to Sputnik. We had one event in the Cold War that really freaked us out. We created ARPA, and never again be surprised by a nation's technology. Okay, compare that with a century of humiliation and leveraging that for political power so that the CCP gains benefits simply by representing that it's in the lead on science. Never mind the security ramifications of the economic competitiveness or any of the geopolitical leverage. Intrinsically, there's a political return by being a leader in science. And you're not leveraging just one satellite orbiting before we got up there. It's a whole century of political capital you're leveraging. And I'm just of the opinion we're slow to wake up. If we're going to frame this as a competition, these guys are on the curve, but we are very slow to wake up to what we're up against. Even in the engineering school at Stanford, we think we have the best engineering school in the world. Now that may be true, but according to US News and World Report, we're now out of the top 20, I think. Right? And the top 10 are all out of Asia, with 9 of the 10 in China. And we're just sort of asleep. I really, it's like we don't know what's coming at us.
Word.
we got Drew all fired up.
Yeah.
He's ready to go.
That's a perfect transition, the system level competition angle here. And I want to bring Aaron in right now, because Aaron, you spend a lot of time following competition in information and influence spaces globally, but also within the United States. And there's a large section in last year's report from the Commission on the competition in Southeast Asia, in particular, and the Pacific Islands. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how China has made remarkable inroads economically, culturally, diplomatically in these spaces, and the withdrawal of the United States from some of them, and how that's impacting not only the system level competition, but also sort of the contours of the kind of world we're living in. And what you think the way to get back in the game might be in a way that is good for the region and also good for the United States.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to be commenting on this fantastic and important report. So I think the answer to that is really multifaceted, and I think that you can look at that issue in a number of ways. So one has to do with the struggle for soft power between the United States and China and what that means around the world. Another way to look at that is economics, the actual share of investment that sort of is appealing for these countries coming from the United States compared to China. And those are two major issues. But third is a sort of more broader conversation about what the international order does look like and what it should look like. So to touch on each of those areas, I think that when you're thinking about soft power, the idea that the United States should be seen as a sort of liberal, the leader of the liberal international order, has been something that's been a bedrock of UN foreign policy for quite a long time. China is very much offering an alternative to that sort of concept. So in particular, you see, and there's a wonderful paper out of Yale by Dan Mattingly and his colleagues that found that if you, in a survey experiment, sort of this was distributed across 16 different countries, and you gave readers, the sort of typical readers in these countries, propaganda articles from the Chinese apparatus talking about the strength of the China model in economics, it was tremendously persuasive. So people who read that propaganda believed that China's economic model was a representation of a way forward for their country, and they became more critical about what the US was offering and the global liberal order more broadly. So I think that sort of propaganda is very effective. It's also very inexpensive from a geostrategic viewpoint. It's a great investment if you're an autocrat and you want to shape world discourse about these issues. So I think that in that area in particular, the US has really been on the back foot. There hasn't been an effort to promote, ideas about what are the benefits of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So I think that sort of strategic consideration is very important. So that's one area. And in terms of economics, China's economic investment in these countries in Southeast Asia, but also in developing countries around the world, is tremendously large. And if you speak with political elites, even opposition figures in those countries, a lot of them see that economic opportunity is so important that the US is, again, on the back foot and sort of being someone who's at the table, sort of offering new investments, sort of transportation, information infrastructure. Those sorts of investments are tremendously important and influential in shaping who's actually the partner that one can work with in sort of an expedient manner. So I think that's a tremendously important issue too. And third, this is all going around in the sort of swirling climate of what should the international order look like. And there I think that the US-Malaysia recent trade deal was a really interesting lens into this issue. So in particular, so the US, the recent US-Malaysia trade deal deal had, I believe, 48 stipulations about things that Malaysia would need to do, and only 3 that the U.S. would do. And in a sense, there were some major wins of this trade deal from the U.S. perspective. So, the core issues were the idea of transshipment, the idea that it's important to enforce these export controls, and to do so, it's really important to ensure that China isn't simply moving its exports through Southeast Asia into the United States. That's a tremendously important issue, and also tremendously difficult to sort out what share. If you're going to say a benchmark, and the Trump administration goal was 30% of this product if it's manufactured in China, then there's going to be a huge extra transshipment tax. If you're talking about how do you determine that 30%? Is it by weight? Is it by size? What about services? So all of these sorts of issues are very, very difficult to actually judge, sort of technically speaking. But nonetheless, it's a very worthy goal. So I think that working on that issue was incredibly important. But at the same time, it created a lot of domestic pushback in Malaysia. So the way that this was negotiated was very rapid, very secretive, and you saw a lot of Malaysian political figures, particularly in the opposition after the trade deal was negotiated, say that, look, this is clearly just a great game, international politics, Malaysia is being carved up, and this doesn't serve our interests, we're just being pushed around by the United States, comparing this 48 versus 3 stipulations in this trade agreement. So where does that leave us? I think that one of the issues that we should consider is how the U.S. wants to go about pursuing its national interest in this broader environment. And I think that in Southeast Asia, you have a number of nations who are huge trade partners with China, right? China's a force they can't ignore, and I think that Singapore there is actually a really good example of the dilemma faced by many of these countries, which is, Singapore is always going to the United States and saying, don't make us choose, don't force us to choose between the U.S. and China, you might not like the choice that we make, and it's unnecessary, we hope to benefit from both sides. And we should think about the potential pernicious impacts of that trade very clearly as well. So for example, a research project or paper that I did here with Brett Carter, we found that Huawei investment in these digital technology transfers had very pernicious effects on digital repression in autocracies, but no negative impacts that we could discern in democracies. So we have to be aware of sort of host country or recipient country dynamics as well, and potential pushback that these, potentially more coercive seeming U.S. initiatives might have on changing the dynamic and forcing these middle powers to look for potentially other, friends and partners in the area.
Yeah, I want to bring us around to developments really in the last 2 or 3 weeks. In particular, Mark Carney's speech at Davos, which in some ways was sort of, I think, stating the obvious, that the old liberal international order, that the jungle has grown back, to quote Robert Kagan. And the sense that nations are now in it transactionally, which I think is a very comfortable position for the current administration. It's exactly how they feel about a lot of their relationships in the world. How much truly has fundamentally changed? We've seen a long line of leaders, like Carney just went to Beijing, Starmer is there now, getting very little in return, almost sort of thumbing their noses at the United States. How much is on offer for them from China? Ultimately, and how much structurally will change for them? At the end of the day, do they really have options other than the United States? And is it then just a matter of how we play it, how we execute our relationships with them, rather than the sort of atmospherics of it?
So that's a great question, a really big question too. So I think that one of the ways we should think about that is in terms of our diplomatic capital and goodwill, right? So there are going to be requests that the U.S. wants to make of allies and friends and partners, and they're going to be much less likely to follow through or sort of to work cooperatively. So I think that we're going to see a lot more move to sort of a multipolar world order, and certainly less goodwill with a lot of these countries. And insofar as you believe that a lot of the free and open Indo-Pacific is in the U.S. interest, it's important for the U.S. to sort of work in cultivating that. And I think that its relations with the Quad are actually quite interesting in this respect. So Trump famously sort of resurrected the Quad, but in the second Trump administration, it's been interesting dynamics, right? So both the 2017 national security strategy and the recently released released 2025 national security, they both mentioned the Quad once. And Trump too, so on his very first day in office, Marco Rubio met with Quad leaders, or Quad foreign ministers. And so there was this early focus on the importance of using the Quad as an organization to contain China or sort of respond to China. But that very quickly, that focus died down over time. So we see a lot less. So there was, in November actually of 2025, the Quad was supposed to host a meeting, and India was supposed to be the host. This is supposed to happen annually, or has in recent memory happened annually, and India declined to host it. And the reason, of course, is the tariffs that the U.S. has imposed on India, which are actually higher than those it's imposed on China. So, and Japan is very unhappy as well with this sort of $550 billion that it is going to be sort of investing in the U.S. on rather unfavorable terms. So I think that, the mindset of doing these bilateral deals, may sort of come with some relatively short-term economic benefits, but I think that the U.S. may be losing a significant amount of ground in how it's thinking about long-term support and a sort of realignment towards China broadly.
Randy undoubtedly has views here, but one of the things that I would just chime in on is when we sort of thought about China in all of the major interactions of the last 25 years, one of the things that we always hear back is that the Chinese have always looked at our ability to build coalitions around things that are important to us and then watch us march down the road to get them done and accomplish them. Sometimes we screw things up along the way. Still, we have a coalition, the coalition sticks together, and that essentially boxes out China from whatever, the activity is. As I was just listening to Aaron, that was the first thing that sort of came to mind, which is, are we losing that ability to build coalitions? Because that has been sort of, going to the commission's secret sauce thing. It's been one of the sort of secret sauce things that the U.S. has been incredibly capable of doing. Feel however you want about the Iraq War. I worked for a boss that fought against it, but the Bush administration did build an international coalition that was successful in terms of accomplishing the tasks it wanted at the UN and in other sort of international bodies. So as we sort of see that fray a little bit, I do think we need to be very deliberate and thoughtful as to whether or not that is the best outcome or a bad outcome. Randy, you should probably talk about Southeast Asia since you're better at it than I am.
Well, I guess I'd make a couple points. I think there's a narrative about this administration which is probably largely grounded in reality, but there's also the tendency to want to juxtapose against things that are not necessarily reality. For example, I think most presidents are transactional. I think most presidents are America first, or some definition of it. And I think what's been built over the course of decades is a lot more resilient. We're definitely testing it in ways, but if you look at the Indo-Pacific and you say which relationship is worse off since the Trump administration came in, I mean, Takeichi's at 73% popularity, and we have new cooperation in the Southwest Island chain. Yes, hard feelings that we shook them down for $550 billion. We'll see if that actually ever gets its way to the United States and invested. I know some Diet members who have some opinions about that. In Korea, we're defying gravity. We have a progressive government and a Republican president that are getting along famously. We have not only agreements, the president's not talking about pulling forces off the Korean Peninsula anymore. He's actually talking about we need the Koreans for shipbuilding. Albanese comes to Washington and talks about critical minerals and supply chain integrity that we need help on. Marcos comes to the United States and we have renewed agreements, the largest Balikatan exercise we've ever had. Right. So I can sort of point to alliances and partnerships and say, there's some feeling that all this generates that is concerning, and are we draining down a reservoir of goodwill very quickly in ways that may eventually be consequential? I think that's a risk, but to date in the Indo-Pacific, I think we're a little better off than most people want to give us credit for. Now, Southeast Asia doesn't want to choose. They generally don't want to choose in public. In private, they're making very important choices. And Singapore is a great example. Very reluctant to stick their neck out in any ways that might suggest they're leaning. But when they refurbished a pier in Singapore, they extended it to accommodate U.S. aircraft carriers. Last time I checked, Singapore doesn't have aircraft carriers. That was for us. We have more military personnel from Singapore training in the United States than any other country in the world. any other country in the world. Imagine that, and how small Singapore is. So I think you've got to, in a way, sort of disaggregate and look at Southeast Asia and look at not only the benefits they're getting from China. I mean, transshipment is a controversial issue for us. If you go to Indonesia, if you go to the Philippines, Vietnam, in many ways it's controversial for them because it's displacing domestic production and manufacture of the same goods that are coming from China due to overcapacity and being resold to the United States. So it's a little more of a complicated picture, I think. So I guess I choose to be a little more glass half full here, but I share the concerns, understand the concerns, and I really think there's a lot of pressure on our agencies, our military, our institutional relationships, because that's where the resilience is going to come from.
Thank you. So before we go to the audience Q&A, I want to give Drew and Aaron an opportunity in a lightning round. If there's something we haven't talked about that's in the report in this session that you'd like to pull on that was especially impactful that you'd like to put on the table for the audience to know about.
I love a good lightning round.
Yeah. Let's give you guys an opportunity to do that. And then I want to come to you all for a preview on what you have in store for the year ahead. What are the issues that Congress is going to discover they need to pay attention to?
Sure.
Yeah.
Two things. Title of my written testimony before the commission a year ago was Strange Competition. Competition comes in different flavors. Winner take all, converging competition where we both get to a good place, diverging competition where you get an advantage and you race away, one-time prizes. And I think when we collapse everything into the word competition, we lose a type of nuance. And in my little niche of biotechnology, it's just a sliver of this. We've not yet fully understood the nature of competition. And you could get me to do spicy hot takes on it, but I just want to admit I haven't seen a lot of fully fleshed out strategic thinking on the nature of competition and different types of competition. Another thing I want to bring forward, which I don't think is in the report, but is definitely a big topic within biotech, is safety and security, right? And there's certain things that I would wish for Washington and Beijing to cooperate on. The Biological Weapons Convention, bioweapons more broadly, bioterrorism. I think there's an important role for the two nations to lead the world because they both have, for different reasons, a shared interest in living in a world where there are not offensive bioweapons. So just want to get a couple more things out in the open for awareness and consideration.
Super. Aaron.
I thought the vast majority of the recommendations were fantastic and incredibly detailed, and I certainly
majority.
Yes, actually, and they were really helpful. But I'll pick one in particular that I thought was fantastic. So there was recently the agreement to sell NVIDIA's H200 really advanced chips to China. A lot of people were concerned about that. That has sort of long historical shadow too. So you may not know, but there's this amazing story about rare earth magnets. So back in 1995, there was this GM subsidiary in Indiana that developed this amazing technology to sort of create these rare earth magnets. It was very, very powerful and is used very widely today. So that was in the early 90s. And then 1995, the Clinton administration decided it was fine for GM to sell this subsidiary to this international group of investors, two of whom were sons-in-laws of Deng Xiaoping. A few years later, in 2001, all of the firm's technologies were moved to China in 2004, the firm in Indiana was totally shut down. So I think that was like a wonderful microcosm about how technology transferred is really impactful in some of these long-term scientific, geostrategic developments. And I worry that the sale of the H200 chips are going to proceed along similar lines. So one of the recommendations of the report was to allow the renting of these chips through cloud computing. And I thought that was a really fantastic and actionable workaround for something with potentially very long-range implications if we choose to sell these chips.
That's a compliment to Leland Miller, our colleague.
And Chris Levin.
And Chris Levin, thank you.
Yeah. So over to you two for what's in store.
Oh man, we got goodies like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start. The commission has some things that we have to report on every year by virtue of the law and what Congress asks us to do. So you'll always have a chapter on Taiwan, you'll always have a chapter on Hong Kong, but we have discretion to select other areas. And I think a great example of that last year was also space, which we haven't even talked about. That's one of Mike's favorite topics. So this year, our first hearing is on India and the U.S.-India relationship and how we're looking at China and potentially cooperating or not cooperating across a spectrum of issues, economic, security. We're going to have a hearing on the undersea domain, which is full suite, submarines, anti-submarine warfare, but also communication cables, also undersea mining, seabed mining, et cetera, et cetera. So look at where we are in the competition there. We're going to look at...
I think we're co-chairing that one, aren't we?
I believe that's correct. Correct. So tune in. And then...
If you like what you see here, tune in.
Yeah. Western Hemisphere. We're doing a hearing on China and Western Hemisphere, and we're going to do some travel to the region as well. One of the things that...
We are in the region.
We are very much resident here, and what's going on in our neighborhood is very...
We even picked the topic before it was cool.
Yeah, well, that's your job.
So watch this space. What else did I...
I mean, those are the three hearings we've decided on. There's still a few more we have to make decisions on. I think one of the things that I hope we'll talk about this year is convergence. We've done some good work Randy mentioned space. Drew informed us on biotech. We've done some good work on quantum. The year before that, we had, but again, before it was cool, we said the U.S. should pursue an artificial general intelligence program, and now you're sort of seeing, not sort of seeing, you are seeing Dario Gil through Project Genesis essentially pursue that exact endeavor. I think as we sort of look ahead now, one of the things we're going to start seeing is how do some of these things start converging, and how does that convergence accelerate things that are happening in the respective ecosystems? And so I think that's one of the through lines that you're going to sort of see us pull into the front pages. And then just since Randy mentioned space, and I think this is also sort of straight across the board here, I think the analogy, and Drew helped me come up with this analogy just by listening to him over the last few years. You know, we've been humming along at sort of 100 miles an hour down a highway in terms of our innovation ecosystem, and we're still cruising along. And I still, you know, glass half full, I still totally believe in the American innovation machine. I've traveled to factories, universities, research and development facilities that you guys don't even know exist, and all kinds of other places. And like, the machine, it works, but it doesn't run on fairy dust. It runs on money. So we're cruising along. Here's the problem. And everyone's been on a highway when you're cruising along at 60, 65, 70 miles an hour, and that car all of a sudden appears in your rearview mirror, and you're like, holy cow, that car's going fast. And then before you know it, it has blown past you, your window rattles, and you're like, oh my God, that car was going really fast. That's what's happening in the sort of competition space with China right now. They're not always really far behind us in the rearview mirror. Sometimes they're real close up, but they are coming fast. And so when that car passes at 150 miles an hour, I mean, hitting the gas when it passes you doesn't do anything. And it needs persistent, constant investment. And that's how we really need to think about the S&T ecosystem, the sort of engineering ecosystem that layers on top of that, and all of these areas. And so that, I think, is going to be the narrative that we sort of pull into the 2026 report, and how we continue our work.
Knitting it all together. Thank you. Over to you in the audience here for your questions, and please.
Thank you. My name is Takahiro. I have a very quick question about the human resource aspect. We discussed about equipment or facilities, but it seems like United States have led by the entrepreneurs, very specific individual to create innovations. So how could we, American universities can maintain comparative advantage to produce more innovative leaders in compared to Chinese universities? If you have any questions, like more creativity or innovations, not about ranking, it's not about number of publication. It seems like innovation coming from United States. So do you have any suggestion for American universities to educate these innovative individuals? Thank you.
You know, listen, after World War II, there's this guy named Vannevar Bush. And one of the things that he was sort of tasked with by FDR and Truman was to say, we've created this giant war machine. The war is winding down. What are we going to do with all these people? And so what he did was make sure that we created the National Science Foundation, an ecosystem that would allow these academics and all these very smart people to continue their good work. When we did Chips and Science, which originally started as the Endless Frontier, which was essentially Vannevar Bush's Endless Frontier, the intent was to sort of surge resources into that. We didn't really successfully do that, and so I think we need to keep realizing that whether it's this academic ecosystem or sort of the engineering ecosystem, it takes two things. One, it takes people, and two, it takes money. And so as universities sort of think about how to get people, I think one of the things they need to do is band together and really make sure that Washington understands that like resources are required to keep this machine going. And places like Stanford, places like MIT, places like Indiana University, the University of Michigan, like you name the institution, play a vital role in making sure that American leadership, whether it's in biotech, chemistry, physics, or any of the other sort of major areas of science, is vital.
Francis?
I have a question from the online audience. One of our speakers have talked about how the quest to remove China from the U.S. supply chain is good for the U.S. How should we think about that when it comes to products where China does not dominate and that are not of critical significance? What is the value of raising our own costs to hurt China unless there is real benefit for national security or economic resilience?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, should we have some discretion and some prioritization over where we concentrate on supply chain integrity? And I think we should. And having dipped a toe in this a couple of times, it's incredibly hard to have a clean supply chain, and even if you neck down to some very specific product, let alone something that's more complicated.
You've got to give the analogy about DoD and your experience there.
That's exactly where I was going. We've done far too many of these things together.
Might be my work wife.
When I was at Department of Defense in the first Trump administration, we started to ask the question of our defense primes, how vulnerable do you think you might be with respect to supply chain and China's provision of components, parts, pieces that go into U.S. weapon systems? We thought the answer was going to be bad, concerning, like, ooh, 40%, okay, big number, but we can work with that. The response was much more troubling, which was, we have no idea. And the reason they had no idea was because you get to a second-tier supplier, you might have some visibility. You get to a third-tier supplier, fourth-tier supplier, you have no visibility. And nobody ever asked. And, industry that is all about profit and cost optimization doesn't want to ask those questions unless they're really sort of forced to. So it's a really hard thing to do, and I think that alone should drive us to prioritize. But secondly, I think most of us, even if people that would be categorized as more hawkish, don't suggest we should completely decouple, not only because it's not realistic, but because it's not desirable. A market of 1.4 billion people that we want access to. Obviously, we have a president who's fairly obsessed about soybeans, but there are other aspects of this relationship that are mutually beneficial that I don't think we want to turn a blind eye to. So I think all of that points in the direction of being very selective of where you're going to drill down and make sure that you have sort of clean, China-free, for the most part, supply chains. How's that?
Everything you said I agree with. I just boiled down to two things. There's sort of two camps in Washington. Well, there's three camps. The strategic decouplers, the decouplers, and the folks that just want status quo. And I think Randy sort of just did a nice job of walking through the sort of concept of strategic decoupling and where do we need to think about supply chains that we need to have resilience and sort of separation.
So curiously, you said strategic decoupling, not de-risking.
Yes, sorry. These are Washington blob terms that I always reject, but okay, go ahead.
Okay, so I was wondering if that's intentional, if you have a position on that?
No, I mean, these are like, this is one of these things where you go to these think tanks in Washington and people are like, oh, is it decoupling or de-risking? I mean, let's be honest. It's like, let's know what's in the system. Yeah. Let's know where the risk is. Right. And let's decouple.
Right. Okay. The rest is semantics.
I mean, like, it's like
conscious uncoupling.
Yeah, conscious uncoupling. Here, we got a new one.
There we go. Okay, so we've got four camps now. They're multiplying.
That's going to be our next op-ed.
You heard it here first. Okay. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Here at Stanford. I wanted to return to Randy's point regarding the Commission's recommendation of an Economic Statecraft Institute and a strengthened BIS. I've had the privilege of serving in the National Security Council's International Economics Office, INTECON, and in an ideal world, that organization could serve as kind of a hub for economic statecraft development. And so I'm just curious, why, as we look at the U.S. international economic policy process, is it different in execution than U.S. security policy? Is there something inherent about economic policy, or, for example, the U.S. historical lack of an industrial policy? Is it just a matter of history and kind of path dependence among these multiple agencies? Is there something fundamental, or is this just a bureaucratic problem?
I think there are a lot of ways you can get at this. And one of the ways would be to take the bureaucratic landscape as it is and have a president say, this is the belly button, this is the entity I'm going to empower, everybody listens to this entity, and you can probably get a degree of coordination and harmonization that's better than status quo ante. And I think the Biden administration tried to do that with Kurt Campbell as the Indo-Pacific czar and got everybody sort of, oriented around the China challenge, although they never said competition. Sorry, they did. It was the Obama administration. So you could do that. I think the problem is, and your question sort of gets at, what's different about this space. It's that intra-agency struggle. So commerce feeding into a central location, belly button, large and in charge entity is still going to be an agency with sort of a schizophrenic split identity. They want to sell, they want to export, they want to promote American business, and then there's this part of it that is like, wait a minute, we're supposed to be thinking about national security. Again, same at state, same at Treasury.
DOD.
And DOD, actually, that's true. The other is, the constituencies that care about this stuff. It's not hard to get sort of the DOD enterprise and ecosystem rowing in the same direction if you say the resources are going to be there to do this thing. It is really hard to get the American business community, the people who are involved in entrepreneurship, and people who have a bottom line to start thinking about rowing in the same direction if it comes at a cost. And so, you've got a fighting chance if you start to build the bureaucratic infrastructure that compels that in various ways. I think you have very little chance if you go with status quo ante, and we're going to get what we've been getting.
I'd say two things. One, I think Dilip probably put more life into that office at the NSC than anybody has in a generation, so I thought he did very good work. The second thing I would say is all of the tools of our government in this ecosystem were built to sort of fight the Cold War, right? And so there's one thing you always have to remember that's a distinguisher between today and the Cold War. The Soviet Union was largely isolated from the global economy. China is not. China is like the machine of the global economy from a manufacturing perspective, and honestly on processing and mining, and vital to the global economy. And so, we do have to wire brush, and this recommendation is sort of part of that endeavor, wire brush the tools that we've sort of fought the Cold War with and say, okay, which ones can we keep using? Which ones do we need to hit the refresh key on? And which ones do we need to say, oh my God, we need new ones? And we haven't really done that. And so again, the first recommendation of the commission was basically here's one idea, just to sort of get that conversation going. And the thing that always happens in Washington is, all the think tank industrial complex always comes out with, let's change the dials by a degree or two, or adjust the volume from 7 to 8. I mean, that's not where we're at, folks. We are in a generational conflict with China. It's not hot conflict. It's an economic conflict, and we have to be thoughtful about how we deploy the tools of government and the sort of other tools of the American system.
We have all kinds of euphemisms for what we do: over the horizon, beyond the inbox.
Beyond the inbox. I haven't heard that one. That's a good one.
This is having a quarterback with a really strong arm throw the ball down the field as far as he can and hope that a receiver runs and catches it, because that's where it needs to be. It's going to be really hard to get there. It's going to require sprinting. It's going to require somebody with gifted hands. It's going to require a lot. But we're throwing the football down the field as far as we can on this one.
We've got time for a couple more. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Glenn and Francis, for putting such an amazing panel together, and the panel very informative and transparent, really. But my question is about the concept of biosecurity. You mentioned and talked about the emphasis and recommendation on bioeconomic aspects and activating industrialization and manufacturing. I am wondering, especially Drew, if, last year I remember at Hoover we had this recommendation and reports on the idea of adding biosecurity and concepts such as biointelligence for predictability of biothreats and all that. Was this something that the panel discussed? You guys discussed, or something of an importance at this stage? Thank you.
Drew should chime in. We did not get into the biosecurity conversation at all. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is, I think there's this tension historically, and I say this as someone who had a Q-tip rammed up my nose to see if I had been exposed to anthrax. There's this persistent tension between the the bioinnovation part of the biotech community and the biosecurity part of it. And I think Drew actually talked about this. Let me just say in a really direct way. Because we haven't unpacked biology as a general purpose technology, people get scared by it very quickly. In physics and chemistry, we can sort of program or code in those sciences. We don't code, even though we do know what DNA is, in biotech yet. And so the level of sort of confidence on the security side hasn't come, and that means we don't do enough to stimulate on the bioinnovation side. This is my personal take. And so the Commission's recommendations leaned heavy into how do we think about the bioinnovation space, and it's largely because of the context of which China has done so well in the Made in China 2025 hearing that we had. So that's how we evaluated and didn't get into security. Randy, did I miss anything there?
Drew, please.
One of the lessons of the pandemic is we need to use biotechnology to secure biology. Right? Like those vaccines were RNA vaccines, that's biology. That's a snowflake on the tip of the iceberg. It's also the source of threat, but if we do not have world leadership in biotechnology, if we don't have a world-leading pacing bioeconomy, we have zero chance of being in a good spot with respect to biosecurity. Right? And our report out of Hoover last October, Biosecurity, really tries to lay this out. Should also note that this commission is operating for the moment in parallel with the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, which is ending this year, right? And that report, which came out last spring 25, is a snapshot in time, a term Mike taught me, and did a pretty good job. It is interesting that National Security Commission report, even with that charge in its name, is looking at economic competitiveness, education, how are we doing as a culture and all of nation as we're advancing this. I think it'll be important going forward to take this issue of how do we remain and attain world leadership in emerging biotech and responsibly use that to secure biology, right? And it's not a done deal. This whole biosecurity is a very strange domain because it's a domain of death and suffering that predates biotechnology, right? Like it used to be that we'd just die of infectious disease in large numbers before antibiotics. We still do. 3 million Americans will die this year of infectious disease, right? Approximately, in total, right? But because of that, we just sort of let biology happen to us, and we don't really secure it like we do nuclear or info cyber, which are domains of security risk we created, right? And we're still culturally waking up to this. Well, we're happening to biology now, so we're going to have to be vigilant and sustained and responsible in securing it. We just haven't accepted that responsibility yet. We were talking earlier today, was that the Teddy Roosevelt was taken offline, and it was a 10% reduction in force for the Navy in regions you care about, and we all care about, and that's because of an RNA virus. It's like, how quickly did we forget that? So anyway, it's just, I think it's a great question you're raising, and we have a lot of work ahead of us on biosecurity.
There's a great opportunity to connect what you've been talking about, Drew, to I think the conversation that Aaron engaged in that the bioeconomy has the capacity to provide public goods to the world in a way that the United States used to be known and celebrated for. And we've got examples of that, whether it's PEPFAR or other things that made a difference globally that earned the United States, I think, a deep reserve of goodwill at relatively low cost, and provides opportunities, I think, for the United States to get back in that game in a way that's good for us and good for the rest of the world.
And I hope we do, and I really appreciate what you were saying. That's why I was trying to use the language of Beijing's operating against a reality strategy. If you can solve reality, you can solve problems for people. It starts with your own people, right, but move it out. And it's not just economic opportunity, it's going to be, to your question, public health and biodefense and biosecurity. Like, who can solve the puzzle of biosecurity while have a massive, reservoir of soft power for navigating the world?
I mean, the soft power stuff is incredible. I mean, as I was listening to Erin, she reminded me of this story that I think Randy and I both heard when we were in Indonesia, which was Starbucks will never tell you this, but it was a USAID program working with the Indonesians that created the Sumatran coffee that you either love or hate at Starbucks. And this entire industry in Indonesia is all the result of USAID and some early investments in local farmers and doing all that work. And like, that's soft power. It doesn't happen overnight. It's like a decadal investment, but that is the kind of soft power programs that make a real meaningful difference in economies. And like, think about Indonesia. It is one of the most populous countries in the world, which I didn't appreciate until we went there. And so, it's one of these places where a little bit of money creates an industry. That industry then, feeds, maybe all of us, delicious or not delicious coffee, depending on how you feel about Sumatran beans.
Erin, you've been cited a couple times in the last few minutes. So I want to give you
I think that's a really good point. And to sort of, to add a more optimistic note into the discussion, I suppose, there's this interesting dichotomy between the effects of CCP propaganda, which is very persuasive abroad on the soft power front, and actual interaction with China on the economic side. So, there are these amazing papers. One of them is by this scholar Goldsmith et al. And so what they find is that essentially when you have a Chinese, aid or economic investment project go in, and they've measured this at like a very local level, and they have surveys before and after this investment goes in, and what they're able to find is that after a local population is exposed to the Chinese aid project, they tend to develop more negative public opinion about China, more criticism of corruption in their locality. And what's extra interesting is that even though nothing changed about U.S. or U.K. engagement, there's a huge spike in evaluations of like the Western developmental model in that. So there's all if you look cross country, there's all this evidence that the more you see economic trade with China, the more public opinion about China in that country decreases. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind here, especially because the very famous set of economics papers by David Autor et al. That measure the economic impacts of trade with China in manufacturing sectors in the United States. It was a wonderful paper, and what they found was that in these areas that were most exposed to labor competition with China, basically Chinese goods putting local workers out of work, you see a huge uptick in social services uptake, unemployment, all these negative outcomes that then go on and transfer into politics, right? That affects their voting. They want to vote for legislators who are going to oppose that sort of trade with China. But the thing is, in Southeast Asia also, as you see this trade with China increase, it's going to have the same follow-on effects, I think. So it isn't, from the U.S. perspective, it's not all doom and gloom in that China is doing so much to engage economically with these countries while we're not at the table. While that is in many respects the case, China does have these own issues of its own that sort of impede the long-term cultivation of allies and friends, particularly in democracies.
And that's the great optimistic note to end on. I think there are a lot of opportunities there that are on the table for us to work with traditional allies and partners and make new friends around the world and move forward together. And so all is certainly not lost. And it's just about sort of refocusing and getting back in the game. I want to thank our panelists tremendously for a really engaging conversation.